Perhaps you are saddened by the possibility that the end of the system will not come in your lifetime. With this single sentence buried inside the latest Watchtower magazine, Jehovah's Witnesses are being forced to reckon with something the leadership has spent more than a century denying. The possibility that Armageddon may never arrive, at least not in the lifetime they have long been conditioned to expect. For decades, Watchtower publications have thundered with urgency. The end is near. It was not just a slogan, but a centerpiece of the group's theology. Children were told not to pursue careers or higher education because the world would not last that long. Families delayed long-term planning, believing paradise was just around the corner. Generations of believers lived and died under this assumption. And now, after decades of false alarms, subtle recalibrations, and outright doctrinal reversals, the organization's leadership attempts to soothe disappointed followers with the banal platitude, Jehovah is patient. Let's read the paragraph in the November 2025 Watchtower. It says, perhaps you are saddened by the possibility that the end of the system will not come in your lifetime. If you feel that way, what can help? Try to remember that Jehovah is patiently waiting to bring an end to this wicked world. But his patience is not without purpose. His patience is allowing millions of people the time and the opportunity to come to know him and serve him. So when you feel discouraged, try to think about how many people will benefit from Jehovah's patience before the end comes. Might some of them be members of your own family? Patience. This is the new justification for decades of failed predictions, ruined lives, broken dreams, and families who sacrificed everything in expectation of an apocalypse that stubbornly refuses to arrive. And this paragraph is not just spiritually manipulative, it is morally obscene. This is not merely a matter of theology. It is a human rights issue, a story of institutional betrayal, and a cautionary tale of how religious certainty can be weaponized against entire generations. To appreciate the sheer audacity of the Watchtower's current patience narrative, we must begin with its history of failed predictions. Jehovah's Witnesses, formerly known as the Bible Students, have never been a passive wait-and-see faith. They were born in the crucible of apocalyptic fervor. Charles Taze Russell, the movement's founder, confidently identified 1914 as the year the end of the Gentile times would bring about Armageddon. The world did not end, but rather than admit error, the movement rebranded. 1914 was reframed as the year Christ invisibly began ruling in heaven. From there, the Watchtower doubled down. The 1920s saw proclamations that millions then living would never die. The 1970s brought another fever pitch of expectation, with literature strongly suggesting that 1975 would be the culmination of 6,000 years of human history, and therefore the year Armageddon would occur. Witnesses sold homes, abandoned careers, and dedicated themselves full-time to door-to-door preaching, convinced that the end was imminent. When 1975 came and went, the Watchtower slyly blamed members for reading too much into their publications. It was classic gaslighting. We didn't predict anything, you misunderstood. Yet the printed record shows otherwise. Fast forward to the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the governing body shifted to this generation doctrine, teaching that the generation alive in 1914 would not pass away before the end came. As the decades rolled on and that generation died out, the doctrine was redefined, stretched, and mangled to avoid admitting error. The generation now meant an overlapping cohort of people whose lives somehow linked to 1914, a theological contortion so absurd it borders on parody. And against this backdrop, the new statement acknowledging that members may feel saddened if the end doesn't come in their lifetime is not just disingenuous. It is a betrayal. The organization created the expectation. It fanned the flames of urgency for over 100 years. It extracted labor, loyalty, and money under the pretense that time was short. Now, as the fantasy collapses under its own weight, they pivot to patience. The cruelty of the Watchtower's latest statement lies not in theological error, but in the psychological damage it inflicts. And for decades, witnesses have lived in suspended anticipation, a psychological state known as the apocalypse mindset. And unlike mainstream Christians who may view Jesus' return as a vague hope, witnesses are taught to expect Armageddon as an imminent, datable event. And this mindset has profound consequences. Life planning is stunted. Many witnesses have foregone education, careers, and financial stability because they believe the world will end any day now. To suddenly acknowledge that the end may not come in their lifetime leaves them stranded, often in middle or old age, without savings, skills, or retirement security. And of course, we know higher education is now allowed. And then there are relationships that are sacrificed. Witnesses are pressured to cut off their family members who leave the faith. The rationale? Loyalty to Jehovah requires purity before the imminent end. How many families have been permanently fractured by shunning, only to find out decades later that Armageddon is still nowhere in sight? And then there's chronic anxiety and depression. Living under the constant threat of divine destruction creates a baseline of fear. Followers are made to feel guilty for not doing enough in the ministry, for not being zealous enough, for not bringing family members into the truth before it's too late. When the end doesn't arrive, that guilt festers into depression. And of course, then there's survivor's guilt. Witnesses who quietly exit their religion often grapple with a sense of wasted years. They feel robbed of opportunities to live freely, pursue education, or build lasting relationships. The Watchtower's "Jehovah is patient" refrain only compounds this pain by reframing wasted decades as a noble sacrifice. In short, the Watchtower's shifting narrative is not harmless theological speculation. It is a system of psychological manipulation that traps members in a cycle of fear, sacrifice, and disappointment. Jehovah is patiently waiting, the article proclaims, and at first glance, this might seem comforting, a reminder that God's timing is perfect. But under scrutiny, the logic crumbles. If Jehovah's patience means waiting centuries to destroy the wicked, why has the Watchtower spent over 140 years insisting the end is near? Why did it repeatedly tie Armageddon to specific years, events, or generations? Why condemn millions of witnesses to lives of poverty, limited education, and family estrangement on the premise that there was no time left? The appeal to patience is in effect a divine alibi for human failure. The governing body is attempting to rebrand its decades of false prophecy as part of God's mysterious timetable. The rhetorical sleight of hand is breathtaking. It's not that we misled you, it's that God is mercifully delaying the end so more can be saved. But who benefits from this delay? Not the rank and file witnesses who has sacrificed education, financial security, and family bonds. Not the elderly pioneers who now face retirement with no savings, having spent their lives knocking on doors. The only beneficiaries are the Watchtower leadership themselves, who continue to live comfortably, sustained by the labor and donations of the very people they misled. In other words, Jehovah's patience is just another way of saying, keep waiting, keep sacrificing, keep giving, and don't you dare hold us accountable for being robbed. The paragraph also employs a classic technique of gaslighting, reframing legitimate feelings of disappointment as a spiritual weakness. Perhaps you are saddened. Notice the subtle insinuation. Sadness at Armageddon's delay is not framed as a rational response to decades of broken promises. It is positioned as a personal failing, a lapse of faith. The solution? Not to question the governing body's track record of error, but to try to remember that Jehovah is patiently waiting. And this rhetorical move absolves leadership of responsibility while pathologizing the very natural grief and disillusionment of members. If you feel discouraged, it's not because you were lied to, it's because you haven't yet cultivated the right spiritual mindset. This is textbook manipulation. Victims of cultic systems often report being told that their doubts or sadness are personal weaknesses rather than legitimate responses to organizational harm. The Watchtower statement is a masterclass in this abusive dynamic. The paragraph closes with a cruel twist. Might some of them be members of your own family? Yeah, the Watchtower exploits one of the most powerful emotional levers imaginable: love for one's family. The implication is chilling. Yes, you may feel discouraged that Armageddon has not yet come. Yes, your own life may feel wasted. But what if this delay allows one of your relatives to join the faith and survive the end? Isn't your sacrifice worth it? This is guilt tripping of the highest order. It weaponizes the natural desire to protect one's family against the believer, coercing them into accepting endless waiting and disappointment as noble, even necessary. The cruel irony is that this very same organization demands that witnesses shun non-believing family members, fracturing families in the present while dangling the fantasy of future family unity in paradise. It is a bait and switch of breathtaking cynicism. Destroy your family relationships now, but keep hoping the delay of Armageddon might eventually save these very same people. The consequences of this theological shell game are not theoretical. They are real, measurable, and tragic. There were witnesses who never pursued higher education that are now trapped in low-paying jobs or poverty. There are witnesses who declined life-saving medical treatments such as blood transfusions, believing survival in paradise would make earthly survival irrelevant. And there are witnesses who remained in abusive marriages because divorce was not an option in a world supposedly on the brink of ending. And there are those who lived with crushing guilt for not doing enough in the ministry, even as the decades passed and Armageddon never came. These are not isolated cases. They are the lived reality of millions of people worldwide. Each one represents a life truncated, a dream deferred, a family broken, not by God's patience, but by the manipulations of an organization that refuses to admit its errors. And perhaps the most infuriating aspect of this entire charade is that the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, the self-proclaimed faithful and discreet slave, faces no accountability for its failures. When prophecies fail, the membership is expected to absorb the disappointment as a test of faith. When lives are ruined by bad counsel, the organization offers no restitution. When members age into poverty, the organization does not provide pensions or financial support. Meanwhile, the governing body enjoys a comfortable lifestyle at the world headquarters in Warwick, New York. They are shielded from poverty, shielded from the consequences of their own teachings, and shielded from the accountability by a membership too fearful to question them. In effect, the Watchtower's failed apocalyptic predictions function as a kind of pyramid scheme. At the bottom, millions of witnesses sacrifice their lives, and at the top, a handful of leaders reap the benefits. And when the scheme collapses under its own weight, they simply invent a new excuse. Some might dismiss this as an internal matter, relevant only to members of the faith. But the Watchtower's manipulation of hope has broader implications. It illustrates how authoritarian systems, religious or otherwise, exploit human vulnerability. By controlling time itself, by dictating the future as if it were certain, leaders can command extraordinary levels of obedience. And the witnesses' experience should serve as a warning to all of us. Be wary of any institution that demands sacrifice today on the basis of promises tomorrow, whether religion, political, or corporate. Such systems thrive on the same formula: urgency, sacrifice, delay, and rationalization. In the end, the Watchtower's latest statement is not a humble acknowledgement of uncertainty. It is a continuation of the same manipulative cycle that has defined the organization for over a century. By reframing disappointment as spiritual weakness, invoking God's patience as cover for institutional failure, and exploiting family love as leverage, the governing body seeks to perpetuate its control even as its credibility crumbles. But the cracks are showing. Former witnesses are speaking out in unprecedented numbers. Online communities are exposing the organization's history of failed predictions. Younger generations raised in the faith are refusing to accept endless waiting as a substitute for a real future. Armageddon may never come. The world may continue, messy and imperfect, long after the Watchtower is faded into history. And when that happens, the greatest tragedy will not be the absence of paradise, but the millions of lives spent waiting for it. If there's any patience worth cultivating, it is not the Watchtower's twisted version of waiting for Armageddon. It is the patience to rebuild lives after leaving a manipulative system. It is the patience to reclaim critical thinking, to pursue education, to mend broken family relationships, to learn how to live in the real world rather than a fantasy of paradise. The governing body urges witnesses to think about how many people will benefit from Jehovah's patience. I would urge instead, think about how many people have already suffered from the Watchtower's impatience, its reckless urgency, its ceaseless false alarms. That is the true legacy of this movement, and no amount of sappy reassurance about God's timing can erase it.